Well, welcome back to Focus Today. Steve Johnson here, filling in the seat with special guests, and we're going to be talking about some of the things that are on the thoughts of the nation, really, when you think of it. Our guest is Bryan Fisher. He's the Director of Issues Analysis for American Family. Good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be back with you.
I have a question first before we get into the President's State of the Union address, which I think to some degree baffled a lot of us, because did we really hear the State of the Union? I want to ask you about that, but first tell me a little bit. Issues Analysis for American Family. Tell me about your organization. What do you do?
Well, the American Family Association came into being in about 1978. Don Wildman wanted to find some family-friendly viewing for his family during the Christmas season. Kids were home on Christmas break. Could not find a single solitary thing on the three major networks that he was willing to expose his family to. So he became concerned about kind of the general decline in decency, particularly in the television medium. So he began to respond to that and try to appeal to the networks to be a little more responsible with family-friendly programming. And that kind of branched out into a concern for pornography. And now in general, we work in general with issues that have to do with the health of the American family. You know, we want America to be the friendliest place in the world to raise a family, and we're concerned about cultural drift. So we'll weigh in on public policy issues. We will appeal to advertisers. We'll appeal to major companies not to support the gay agenda, and so forth. So that's what we're about. The bottom line is we really want to bring America back to the Judeo-Christian values on which this nation was founded. To call America back to that, we think that would be good, and that's the only way America's got a future.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the summary. That's good to have the basis of all of that. Okay, so this State of the Union address, I think our recent ones have kind of drifted from what they used to be. I have a feeling if we went back to FDR and Truman and some of those, they were mostly the State of the Union. Where are we at? Where do we need to go? And this one didn't seem to have a whole lot of oomph behind it, except in some areas that I think probably organizations like yours is very concerned with. Give me an overall view. What did you think? What was your take back when you turned the TV off after watching it? What did you think of this latest State of the Union address?
Well, I think it was fairly typical for this president. It was more of a campaign speech than a status report on the health and condition of the union. And the reality is the state of our union right now, Steve, is not strong. We are not united. We are very divided. A recent poll I saw, I think it was Gallup, indicate that 68% of the American people thinks that the United States is on the wrong track. I think the president knows that. He knows his policies have not worked. And, you know, the bottom line, when you have the president listen to him talk for an hour about all of the problems that we have in America, well, really, this is 5 years into his presidency. So in one sense, President Obama was really campaigning against himself. He was telling the American people, look, we've got to spend the next 3 years cleaning up the mess that I have created over the last 5. So it was kind of an admission, I thought, on his part, of a pretty much abject failure on what he's tried to do in the last 5 years. I was struck looking at the left-wing media, how they responded, how tepid they thought this speech was, how it lacked energy. You used the word oomph. And repeatedly they said there was no energy here, there was no a passion here. Democrats are running from this president. You know, several Democrats that are running for re-election in the Senate were asked after the State of the Union speech, do you want President Obama campaigning for you? Mark Begich in Alaska, Mark Pryor down in Arkansas, Mark Udall in Colorado, and all of them said no. Basically, you know, you parse what they were saying. I don't want this president anywhere near me when it comes up to re-election, because Obamacare is the major accomplishment of his first term in office, and that's a complete and utter total disaster. I heard you talking about what's happening in Oregon, you know, before you brought me on. That's a total and utter disaster. Oregon spending, what, $300 million, and I don't know what the enrollee numbers are up to now, but it's, you know, pretty dismal report. So, you know, his signature piece of legislation has turned out to be catastrophic in its failure. So there's very little for him to run on. So there's an opportunity, I think, for the Republican Party, if they will send a strong conservative message. It's a possibility they could even take control of the Senate in November if they're smart.
Now, that'll be a very interesting thing to see take place if it does, because you're right, there's 5 or 6 seats that have been targeted there in the Senate. We'll have to see how that works out. You know, for a lame duck president, when he does the State of the Union, I think that's a little different than when they're taking the job at the very beginning. We heard a lot of people talking about the imperial presidency concept, where he's saying, hey, I don't care if Congress is with me or not, I got my pen, I've got my phone, and I will make my own passage of laws. How does that concern you? Do you see that as a major constitutional violation, as some have said could very well be the case?
Well, I think this ought to be of enormous concern to all Americans, especially Americans that love liberty and love freedom and love our Constitution, because he's really arrogating to himself what amount to dictatorial powers here, because he is dictating to the American people in ways that he has no constitutional or moral authority to do. You know, I just cracked open my Constitution, Steve, just before we came on air, and let me just read the Article 1. I mean, this is the first article in the Constitution, first section, Article 1, Section 1. This is after the preamble. This is after we the people to form a more perfect union and so forth. Well, here's how we do it. Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. You know, and I point to the word all there. How many legislative powers were assigned in the Constitution by the founders, by we the people, to Congress? All of them. All legislative powers are vested in Congress. So there's not a single legislative power that can properly be exercised by either the executive branch or by the judicial branch. And what we have now with we're used to this kind of overreach from the judiciary, where they are legislating from the bench. That bothers us. It's bothered us for decades. And now we have somebody legislating from the Oval Office, which he has no constitutional authority to do, because all legislative power is invested in the Congress. So when he exercises these executive orders to simply dictate to the American people things that Congress has not enacted, in some cases things that Congress has rejected. For instance, with immigration reform, Congress would not give him what he wanted there, so he just started issuing dictates about how immigration law was going to be selectively enforced. He doesn't have the moral or constitutional authority to do that. You know, Congress tried to pass an act that would rein in C4 organizations in a way that suited him. It didn't pass, so he's directed the IRS now to crack down on C4 organizations and try to silence them, you know, within 60 days of a general election, by prohibiting them from publishing voters' guides and legislative scorecards and registering people to vote and conducting get-out-the-vote campaigns. He's got no authority to do this. So this is really the exercise of dictatorial powers, completely contrary to the form of government that the founders established for us.
All right. I want to mention to our listeners and viewers that we're talking to Bryan Fisher. He's the Director of Issues Analysis for the American Family Association. As it relates to your organization, the American Family Association, I'm thinking back, I didn't really hear the president talk much about families in general. Sometimes you'll hear more about that, and that's one of those inclusive things that everybody can agree with. I didn't hear too much about anything really affecting the family, but from your perspective, did you hear him address much at all about the issue of the American family and what needs to be done in that State of the Union address?
No, he did not. Very disappointing. The only mention to family was his press for marriage equality, again, sending the signal he wants to redefine marriage as God created it, as God designed it, as God defined it. That was the only mention. Talked a lot about income inequality and dealing with poverty. But we know from the social research that's been done, Steve, we know that the number one antidote to poverty is marriage. We know that from all the social research that's been done. If a woman gets married, marries the father of her children, it will lift her out of poverty 75 to 80% of the time. So the solution to poverty in America is very simple. It's to send a message in every component of our culture that the way forward is to reserve sex for marriage. Wait till you get married to have sex. Wait to have kids until you get married. And the two of you can build a household in together. And that's the antidote to poverty. We know that's the best environment for children. If you want to end this generational cycle of poverty, that's the way to do it. Have children born into a home where they're raised by a mom and a dad who love each other, who stay together, set that model for their children so that when they reach adulthood, they're going to replicate the model they got from their parents. Right now, the model that they're getting, single parenthood, poverty, government dependency, is just a recipe to perpetuate this cycle indefinitely. And sadly, the president didn't address that at all.
All right, just finally, since we have a couple years left with his presidency, what is it that you are expecting from the Obama administration? Anything to increase due to desperation and this imperial mode, or anything that you have of specific concern, maybe?
Well, I think what we heard from the president on Monday night or the State of the Union speech, he said, look, if Congress is not going to work with me, I'm just going to act on my own. So basically, he just informed the entire nation, I'm going to spend the last 3 years of my presidency ignoring the restraints of the law, ignoring the restraints of the Constitution. And the reality is he will get away with as much as the American people will let him. And I think he will continue to push the limits, push the borders. He knows he's running out of time. He knows he's lost juice with the American people. He doesn't have any leverage now with Congress because he's considered, even by people on his side of the aisle, as a lame duck. So I think we have a lot of reasons to be concerned, a lot of reason to appeal to our legislators to step up to the plate and put a stop to this. And right now, I just heard this morning that the House is going to convene a hearing on what the President Obama is trying to do to 501c3 and C4 organizations through these IRS regulations. So there's some effort now made to push back on these dictatorial successes, and that's what we need to watch and what we need to support.
Well, I think a lot of us in the news media have been watching this, wondering when is that going to happen. Congressmen have been saying, well, it takes a long time because it'll probably have to go through the court system and all that. So we'll have to see. Some people are saying this can't last for another 2 years in the mode that it's in now with the executive orders, but we'll have to see. And you will be keeping us up to date with that, I suppose?
Well, I will, Steve. And one last thing is I think state governments have a lot to do with this. They can resist some of these unconstitutional orders from the federal government. For instance, on marriage, I would like to see states that have constitutional amendments that prohibit the recognition of same-sex marriage simply defy a federal ruling that tells them they have to recognize it. They say, no, we don't. We're not going to allow our county clerks to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples because the people of this state have defined marriage, and we're going to protect it, and we're going to recognize the will of the people. We're going to uphold the law and uphold our state constitution. So there are other ways that this problem can be dealt with.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for being with us. Bryan Fisher, he's the Director of Issues Analysis for the American Family Association. Thank you. Appreciate that.
You're welcome, Steve. Always good to be with you.
All right. I'll tell you what, coming up, we're going to be talking, going to the legislative side of things in Oregon and talk about the upcoming special session that's going to be held on Monday with one of our state representatives. So stay tuned for that coming up on Focus Today.